Hello and welcome to part 8B of my beginner's guide to colour genetics in budgerigars. In part 8A we began to explore the Yellowface mutations, and in particular we looked at the Yellowface Mutant 1. If you haven't seen that video, I will put a link across the top of the screen now so you can go back and watch that before continuing with this part 8B. And in part 8B we will look at the Yellowface mutation 2 and also the Goldenface mutation, and we'll review some of the current literature and findings from a number of key pieces of work that have been done that I think demonstrate how the two Yellowface mutations, the Yellowface mutation 2 and the Goldenface mutation, act in general with the green, the wild type green, but also in terms of where they sit and on which of the chromosomes and which genes they are allele of. So in part 8A we established that the Yellowface Mutant 1 was an allele of the blue gene, and indeed we managed to begin to establish a hierarchy for that particular gene family, with the green, wild type green, being dominant, and then the BL1 or the blue mutation 1, BL2, blue mutation 2 being co-dominant, and when they're on the same bird they produce the Yellowface Mutant 1. But what about the Yellowface Mutant 2 and the Yellowface and the Goldenface? Are these also allele of the blue gene, or do these sit separately? And I think this is quite important, because if the genes sit separately, then there is an argument that the Yellowface is actually dominant to the wild type green, and there is still some debate around whether the Yellowface Mutant 2 and the Goldenface are a dominant variety and dominant to green, and that will affect both in terms of whether they are an allele of the wild type, are an allele of blue, or whether they're a separate mutation, so a separate gene mutation. And that's what we're going to look at in this particular video. We'll begin to establish, look at the evidence, look at the current literature and writings, and begin to explore that. And perhaps, or I will come down, in fact I will come down one side of the fence or the other. So that's the starting point from this, is are they the same mutation, part of the blue family gene mutation, or are they a separate mutation altogether? So in part 8A we introduced the main sources of literature that I've been using in fact throughout this whole guide, but in particular around the Yellowface mutation, to try and indicate where I get the information from. The first of those is a very useful website produced by Bergman. This website contains a whole load of literature, not just produced by Bergman, but he reviews a whole load of literature, pulls out some of the key elements to that across a wide range of Budgerigar mutations. Well worth a look if you're interested in the latest evidence on Budgerigar genetics. There's a section in there where he does talk about the Yellowface mutations and the various Yellowface mutations. So that's the first of the various guides that I use. The second main source is a book by Dr. Terry Martin. This book is a guide to colour mutation and genetics in parrots, and generally the parrots and parakeets genetics work very, very similar. There's a very similar makeup. and there's a section in there dedicated to the parbleu, or the yellowface, as we in Budgerigars fraternity like to refer to it. So that's the second source that I use, that very useful book by Dr. Terry Martin. And another major source is a book by Ken Gray. Ken Gray produced a book called The Rainbow Budgerigar and Its Constituent Parts. And those of you that know the rainbow budgerigar, that know one of the key constituent parts of the rainbow budgerigar is the yellowface mutation. And again, Ken Gray in his book develops a whole chapter on the yellowface mutation. There are a number of other sources, and I'll talk briefly about those as we go through the video that I will be using, but those are the main three sources that we'll be using. So let's have a look at what that literature tells us. So in actual fact, if you review all of those bits of literature, Bergman's review of the literature on the yellowface mutation, and then look at Ken Gray's description in his book, and look at Dr. Terry Martin's description of the yellowface and the parbleu in his book, all three of them come down on the understanding that the yellowface mutation, so all three of them, including mutation 2 and the goldenface, are alleles of the blue gene, and all three of them are recessive to the wild type green. And it leads you to sort of begin to try and work out why some people believe that they're not. And I'll just read a quote from Gray's book. So Gray said, and this was at the time of writing his book, at the time of writing, many Budgerigar breeders still believe that the yellowface blues, including of course those that are of the grey mutation in their makeup, are ordinary blue birds plus an additional mutation which gives them the yellow head and mask. This, according to Gray, this is a misunderstanding, is obviously the reason why some writers have classified the yellowface blue as dominant, whereas in fact they are all recessive to wild type greens. And so clearly Gray in his book and the others believe that it's not recessive, but there is this view that it is. And I think some of this, and in particular Martin talks a bit about this, is about the name of the name that we use. In the fact that we call, so Budgerigar will call the mutation the yellowface mutation, which sort of indicates that there's something producing a yellow face onto the blue bird, whereas the rest of the parrot and parakeet fraternity, virtually all of them, refer to this particular mutation as the parbleu, or the partial blue, so referring to it as being somewhere between a green and the true blue mutation. So you can see that in one view this is the blue bird with in fact a mutation put on top of it, and that additional mutation put on top of it can influence the wild type green. And the second view is that this is in fact just a green bird with part of the yellow pigment removed from it, and leaving just the yellow pigment in the face, and in fact drifting down into the body colour in some cases when we look at the Yellowface Mutant 2 and the Goldenface. So that's some indication as to why that is. So, but why therefore do we believe that it's an allele of blue? Let's have a look at that. So back in 2017 there was a paper produced by Cook, Fisher, Wu and a number of others, so Wu et al. And in that paper they actually identified the actual gene in the Budgerigar that was responsible for producing the protein that produces the interaction that develops the yellow pigment in Budgerigars. So they identified a single gene, so one gene, that was responsible for producing the yellow pigment in Budgerigars. They also suggested, or seemed to indicate, that particular gene produced both the normal yellow pigment and also the yellow pigment that appears to be fluorescent under fluorescent light, so it appears to show up under fluorescent light. And we know that not all of the pigment, the yellow pigment, does that. So if you, and we've known for some time that a budgerigar under fluorescent light conditions, some of its colours are very fluorescent under UV lighting, and other bits aren't. And the yellow areas are, or some of the yellow areas, particularly around the face and the mask area, are fluorescent under UV light. So the first thing we would seem to be that there is a single gene, so one gene producing the yellow pigment, and when that gene mutates, it impacts on the amount of yellow pigment produced, right down to there being no yellow pigment produced. Now, of course, it is possible, you know, I'm not going to say it's not possible, it is possible that there are two genes responsible for yellow, but you often find, or I've found in looking at genetics, that you know the genetics tends to find the simplest way of doing things, and the simplest way of doing things would be that there is a single gene producing the yellow pigment, and that is the gene that was discovered by those particular group of scientists. The paper, in fact, and I'll just read out the paper. So the paper is called "The Genetic Mapping of Biochemical Bases for Yellow Feathered Pigmentation in Budgerigars," and as I say, it's produced by Cook, Fisher and Wu and a number of other scientists. So you can find the paper online, so if you Google that particular thing, you will be able to find that paper online. It is very scientific, a very scientific paper, clearly produced for the scientific community, but if you read through it, you can get the gist of it and you begin to understand what they are saying. So we mentioned that there are some areas of the budgerigar that are fluorescent under UV light. Now, Bergman identified that the areas that are fluorescent under UV light are the same areas that continue to show up on the Yellowface and the Goldenface. And he suggests that there's some correlation between the way the yellow pigment that reacts to UV light is produced and the mutation we see in the Goldenface and the Yellowface Mutant 2. What he's suggesting is that the protein that produces that UV reflective pigment is the same protein that's being produced by the Yellowface Mutant 2 and the Goldenface. Now, if we accept that what the first principle or the first theory that there is a single gene producing that protein, then we can suggest that it's a mutation of that gene that stops the yellow pigment from being produced, but continues to allow the yellow pigment in the fluorescent bit of the yellow pigment, the protein that produces that, to continue to producing it. And depending on how many of those mutations, those second mutations, so the Yellowface mutation 2 and the Goldenface, depends on how much of the pigment is being produced. So in a mutation 1, it appears to come down further, in the single factor, it appears to come down into some of the other feathers, producing that greenish tinge into the blue of the body, and in a double factor it appears to be just limited to the facial area. So it appears that the more mutations that bird has, the greater or the lesser impact it has on the body. So Bergman identifies that there's a correlation between the UV reflective and the yellow, the areas of the yellow face and the golden face that continue to produce a yellow pigment. So based on that, I think we can, we would say or deduce from that the yellow face mutation 2 and the golden face are therefore both allele, so those mutations are both allele of the blue gene. So where do they fit into the hierarchy? But very briefly then, before we look at the hierarchy, what does Hray say about this in his book? Well, Hray used a whole load of evidence based on breeding records. So he looked at people's breeding records and from that began to explore, very much in the same way as Mandel did in his when he looked at how the peas reacted. So that you may remember that from part 1 of this series. So Hray looked at the breeding records, he looked at his own breeding records, he also looked at the breeding records of Cyril Rogers and Cyril Warden and in fact John Papin from the USA. So he combined all those records, all very big yellowface breeders, and looked at how the genes seem to interact based on the birds that they were bred from. And he again concluded that all of the yellowface mutations, so mutation 1, mutation 2 and the goldenface, were all part of the blue allele and were all recessive to the green, to the wild type green. So that's what Hray thought. So we can now look at the hierarchical order for the blue family of genes. So based on the work of Hray, I followed the hierarchy that he used in his book. So he has the wild type green as being dominant to all of the others. He then has the goldenface mutation as the next most dominant variety. It's not dominant to green, so it's recessive to green but dominant to all of the other varieties. He then has yellowface mutation 2 as so that particular mutation is recessive both to the green and to the goldenface, but is dominant to the blue mutation 1 and blue mutation 2. So blue mutation 2 and blue mutation 1 are recessive to all of the other three, so to green, as we already know, and also to yellowface mutation 2 and to the goldenface, but they're co-dominant together. So yellowface mutant 1, so the blue mutant 1, blue mutant 2 co-dominant and produce the yellowface mutant 1. And on this slide you can see that I've placed them down. I've put down the various interactions of the blue allele and how they produce their true varieties. So the true varieties. In my PDF guide that supports this this video guide, you can see all of those. I've placed every single one of them so you can see what I would expect them to produce based on that work of Martin, Bergman and Hray. So in this final slide, I've said I leave the final words to John Papin from the USA, and he said there's nothing mysterious or complicated about the yellowface or goldenface budgerigars. All blues, goldenface blues and yellowface blues are produced by a simple recessive factor that creates the blue and the yellowface or goldenface budgies. By restricting the amount and distribution of yellow on what would have been a green budgerigar if the factors were not present in their double dose pairs. So he makes it very clear, and I'll leave those as the final words on the subject of the yellowface. So that completes this beginner's guide to colour genetics in budgerigars. If you enjoyed the videos, please don't forget to hit the like button and do subscribe. And of course, don't forget that the PDF document that is linked to this guide and goes into a bit more detail is available over on the Shed Talk Facebook page. Once again, thank you for watching.